Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome to again our special edition of reading Carl Schmitt's Concept of the Political. Today we're doing the third section of Concept of the Political, the third section area, number three. Um, Please forgive the fan. We have air circuits, otherwise it's kind of the thundering lightning outside, so maybe I need the air a little bit here. So let's continue, right? Let's continue where we left off in three. The friend enemy concepts are to be understood in their concrete and existential sense, not as a metaphor or symbols, not mixed or weakened by economic, moral, and other conceptions, least of all in a private individualistic sense as a psychological expression of private emotions and tendencies. So therefore, he opens this saying that we have to understand it on its own terms politically, not in terms of the kind of a the individual conscious, even though it's a subjective concept. It's about a an existential thing. It's not a metaphor. It's not a symbol in that sense, and it should not be mixed with moral, economic, and other conceptions, and therefore not understood psychologically. Okay, this is the idea. Psychologically, as a private emotion or tendency, we shouldn't understand it as a personal, private thing. It's about our relationships to the world. Okay, liberalism, in one of its typical dilemmas. Now he's going to be treating it under Section A, right? Dilemmas of intellect and economics, has attempted to transform the enemy from the viewpoint of economics into a competitor, and from the intellectual point into a debating adversary. So therefore, in other words, liberalism has tried to take the enemy and turned him into, from the economic point of view, a competitor, and an intellectual point of view, a debating partner, right? In other words, that's why it's a debating club. In other words, in the domain of economics, there are no enemies, only competitors. And in a thoroughly moral and ethical world, only debating adversaries. In other words, notice it's only debating, a moral and ethical world, only debating adversaries. It is irrelevant here whether one rejects or accepts, or perhaps finds it an atavistic remnant of barbarian times, that the notion continues to group themselves among to be according to friends and enemies, or hopes that the antithesis will one day vanish from the world, or whether it perhaps sounds pedagogically reasoning to imagine that enemies no longer exist at all. In other words, he's kind of mocking. This is the Germanic tone here, is a very mocking tone, saying that, well, this is people. It's so much easier to think that this friend enemy is it's a regression of barbaric times when we were rude. Now we're more sophisticated people, and that we're and reasoning to imagine that enemies don't exist anymore. That's great. Schmitt is actually not kind of Schmitt's like the condescension of what of attack of those who kind of hold that view is kind of here. The concern here is neither with abstractions nor with normative ideals, but with inherent reality and the real possibility of such a distinction. In other words, we don't care. This is not about abstractions or normative ideals, but rather the reality. We're concerned with the reality of how things are and whether this distinction is real. The friend enemy distinction is a real distinction, not that whether it's this idea here that this is only an abstraction and a symbolic representation, and therefore it has multiple meanings. It can he's basically saying that we're looking at the real phenomena, whether this is a real thing. One may or may not share these hopes and pedagogic ideals that one day we may share the idea that, well, we can go beyond conflict and all become friends, right? This idea. But he's saying that no, that's we may or may not share in these hopes and pedagogic ideas, but rationally speaking, it cannot be denied that nations continue to group themselves according to friends and enemy antitheses, that the distinction still remains actual today, and that this is ever present possibility for every people existing in the political sphere. So in other words, this is in other words, we might hope that everyone becomes brothers and the world has kumbaya, but the reality is people still divide these. People still distinguish between groups of us and them, and that as long as that continues, the political will exist. right? That the political as long as the ever present possible every people existing in a political sphere, there's recognition between us and them. The enemy is not merely any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. The enemy is not necessary, this is important to understand. The enemy is not any competitor or just any partner of a conflict in general. He is also he is also not the private adversary whom one hates. In other words, the enemy is not. Notice it's not the private. In other words, this idea of the private, our private problems that we love and hate, right? The love and hate aspect of human life. Our loves, we love particular people. Our loves, the individual actor loves this person or hates this person. This is the personal. This is the private, personal conception for Schmitt. That hate, and this love is not this. The enemy exists only, at least potentially, one fighting collectively of people's one fighting collectively of a people confronts a similar collectivity. So in other words, the friends are, this is a collectivity, this is a community. The Greeks would say koinonia. We would say a collective entity. Oh my God, the and Randy, oh my God, there's collectivism here. No, grow the F up. Collectivism is, we are social or political beings. And because of this, we form into groups. And our group is the way we benefit and survive and live ourselves. And therefore, the effective group is the political group. This is who defines an us, an identity, a way of life, a complete way of life that is sufficient, and not in other words, by sufficient doesn't mean, oh, I don't need anyone else, but rather no, it is enough that it can thrive and develop as a group. Okay, it can sustain itself as a group. It is able to maintain and sustain. So therefore, this is not any mere partner. It is a partner that is a collectivity of this us. Us is this collectivity versus them as their collectivity. It's not a. Again, this is not about personal relations per se, but about groups countering groups, either in the larger sense of communities, but also within a society. When a society is breaking down, and the groups that all of a sudden a society or community breaks down into groups who don't see each other as part of the group or no longer us anymore. All right. Um, the enemy is solely the public enemy because everything has a relationship to such a collectivity of men, particularly to the whole nation, becomes public by virtue of such relationships. In other words, the idea of the nation or the political community. Okay, in other words, that it's the public enemy because all the relationships of collectively men, particularly the nation, produces the nation or the community, and this is public by virtue of that relationship. He's saying the enemy in Latin is hostis. Hostis. This is the Latin, not inimicus in the broader sense. Polemikos, not eutheros. Ukethros. These are the Greek words. These are the biblical words, right? This is the Latin, then the Greek. As German and other languages do not distinguish between the private and the political enemies, many misconceptions and falsifications are possible. The often quoted "love your enemies" Matthew 5:44 and Luke 6:23 reads in Latin "Delecte in inimicos veritos," or okay, I'm not going to read the Greek. I know it's basically here. In other words, this is basically love your personal enemies. Love your. In other words, have a love of agere turus erekreos emonon. Right. This is not didigene hostis veritas. In other words, don't love your political enemies. It's not say love your political enemies. It says love your personal enemies. And there's a very important thing. This is the distinction between the Greek, the scriptural New Testament Greek and Latin emphasizes this is about the Christ command about loving one's enemies. It's not about political, it's about the personal, the thing tied to love and hate, right? No mention is made of the political enemy. Never in a 1,000-year struggle between Christianity and the Muslims did it occur to a Christian to surrender rather than defend Europe out of love towards the Saccharins of the Turk. The enemy in the political sense need not to be hated personally, and in the private sphere only, and in the private sphere only does it make sense to love one's enemies, i.e., one's adversaries. In other words, this idea of loving one's enemy in that sense is only makes sense in the political sphere of the intimate life, in your social settings, in your associations of friends, not in the political sense. The biblical quotation touches the political antithesis even less than it intends to dissolve. For example, the antithesis of good and evil, or the beautiful and the ugly. In other words, the biblical quotation does not mean to destroy the antithesis. It doesn't touch the political antithesis in that sense. It certainly does not mean that one should love and support the enemies of one's own people. Okay. This is the big input. This is Schmitt responding to I know very much Christian conservatives say, oh, you should love one's enemies. No. The scripture account speaks of loving your personal enemies, those who have this entity, this sense. The enemy here is this enemy of this. There's going to be political confrontation. There's going to be, and you should not hate your political enemy. That's another thing that's important. This is something even my teacher, Mel Bradford, said. You have in political life, there's contests. You don't come to hate them. If you hate them as you hate, hating is bad for you. Hating destroys you. Okay, does not. Even though hate is a powerful energy that is used for political purposes. And that is why it's emotional. It was when we use emotion. This is why in politics we use emotion to strengthen political activities. But we should not understand these relations and these structures through our emotions. Okay, that's the point that I think Schmitt is trying to get here on this. The political in its most imminent, intense, and extreme the political is the most intense and extreme antagonism. And every concrete antagonism becomes much more political the closer it approaches the most extreme point, that of the friend and enemy grouping. In other words, this antagonism gets to this most extreme point of the friend and enemy. In other words, that this becomes more political. Antagonisms are going to be here, right? But the antagonism that all of a sudden leads us to then we are no longer friends, and they become friends and enemies. They become the other, the existential other, and not us. And that therefore this is political in that sense. This becomes more political in that sense. That those other relationships become political when it becomes they devolve into the friend enemy distinction. Furthermore, next to the primary political decisions, and under the protection of the decision taken, numerous secondary concepts of the political eminent. So therefore, a decision is made in terms of a decision, and because of a decision needs to be made, a lot of secondary, in other words, a primary political decision is that of friend and enemy. Then the next, numerous secondary concepts of the political emanate from this, right? From that initial thing, right? As to the equation of politics and state discussed early in section 1, it has the effect, for example, of contrasting a political attitude of a state with party politics, so that one can speak of a state's domestic, religious, and educational community, educational, communal, social policy, and so on. In other words, we can talk about these phenomena, these subdivisions of the political, right? This idea that they are going to be the state with their party politics, right? So to speak, one of the state's domestic religious, educational, communal, social policy, and etc., right? Notwithstanding, the state encompasses and relativizes all these antitheses. In other words, all these antitheses of these phenomena, the religious, that will relativize that to that specific phenomena. Now, however, the antithesis and antagonism remains here within the state's domain, which has relevance for the concept of the political. Now, this is Note 10. A social policy existed where, since every political noteworthy class puts forth a social demand, welfare care, which early times were administered by the poor and distressed, had not been considered a sociological problem and was not called such. Likewise, a church policy existed only where a church constituted. This is why those other things. So let's go back here. Finally, even more banal forms of politics emerge. So therefore, we have the fundamental thing is the friend enemy. Then we have these dimensions of these things of, like he says, taking on these dimensions in terms of state, religion issues, educational, communal policy, social policy, etc. And therefore, these are conceptions. In other words, these other antitheses, these other things create antitheses, supporters and opponents, and that becomes kind of a lesser notion of political, right? Even more banal forms of political spirit, which presumes parasite and character-like configurations. In other words, next, even more banal things. Like, what remains here from the original friend-enemy grouping is only some sort of antagonistic moment which manifests itself in all sorts of tactics, practices, competitions, and intrigues. And the more particular dealing and manipulations are called politics. So therefore, all this banal things. Politics becomes like, well, the social politics and the house, the debates about, everything becomes political. Okay, everything becomes political in our social relations. The politics of the office, the interest dating politics. Okay, this is Schmitt is mocking the banal aspects of this. Politics get reduced to these banal concepts, and this is what he's warning against, right? Um, but the fact, okay, the fact, but the fact that the substance of the political is contained in the context of concrete antagonism is still expressed in everyday language, even where the awareness of the extreme case had been lost. So therefore, in other words, even in this banal, our banal understanding of politics, right, our banal manifestation of the political, even there in our ordinary language, even if the larger extreme case of the political, which is that of the social bond against one community against another, one social community, one social nation or people against another. Okay, that is lost. Even our language still maintains it, he says. This is evident in daily speech and can be exemplified by two obvious phenomena. First of all, political concepts, images, and terms have polemical meaning. So polemical. In other words, these things have polemical. Polemics means implies what? We are fighting, we're contesting something. And therefore there's an us and a them, right? First, in other words, they are focused on specific conflicts and are bound to a concrete situation. The result, which manifests itself in a war or revolution, is a friend-enemy grouping. In other words, that the result that reflects in a war, conflict, or a revolution is the friend-enemy grouping, and they turn into empty and ghost-like abstractions when this situation disappears. So a situation, a conflict emerges. In a concrete situation, a conflict emerges that either becomes a war between countries or within a society, revolution, or a revolution, right, or a civil war, a war between states, or a civil war, or a revolution, right, which is a form of civil war in many sense, right. Um, this is a friend enemy grouping in that sense. And then what happens is that once that disappears, these things become an empty ghost like abstraction when the situation, the conflict disappears, right? Words such as state, republic, society, class, as well as sovereignty, constitutional state, absolutism, dictatorship, economic planning, neutral or total state, and so on, are incomprehensible if one does not know exactly who is to be affected, combated, refuted, or negated by such a term. Now, let's go look at number 11. In other words, okay, let's go where was number 11? Okay, 11, this word term republic. Machiavelli, for example, calls all non-monarchical states republic. This definition is still accepted today. Thomas defines democracy as a non-privileged state, hence all non-democracies are considered privileged states, right? 12 here. The numerous forms and degrees of intensity of polemical character are also here possible. But this is a long thing. But the necessary polemical nature of politically charged terms and concepts remain nevertheless recognizable. Terminological questions there become thereby highly polemical. In other words, terminological questions become thereby highly polemical. Political. Sorry, not polemical. Political, because if they become a technical term, there's a dispute about it. The technical terms that are disputed about, then it becomes political in that sense. The word or expressions can simultaneously be reflex, signal, password, the weapon in a hostile confrontation, for example. See Conraner, a socialist of the Second International, in a very significant subbook publication, the Reich Institute and the Private Right, on the Reich Institute and the Private Right, calls rent, which a tenant pays the landlord, tribute. Most German professors of jurisprudence, judges, and lawyers would consider such a designation an inadmissible politicization of civil law relations, and would reject this on the grounds that it would disturb the purely juristic, purely legal, purely scientific discussion. For them, the question had been decided in a legal positivist manner, and therefore residing political design. In other words, and the therein residing political design of the state is thus recognized. Therefore, the lawyers are understanding this jurisprudence, and these guys understand it through existing law, and therefore this is not to call that tribute is to politicize or polemicize the thing. Okay? On the other hand, many socialists of the Second International put very value in calling the payments which armed France imposes on disarmed Germany not tribute but reparations. Reparation appears to be more juristic, more legal, more peaceful, less polemical, and more apolitical than tribute. And in scrutinizing this more closely, however, it may be seen that reparation is more highly charged and therefore also political, because this term is utilized politically to condemn juristically, even morally, the vanquished enemy. He's now phrasing this concept of reparations that sounds legal, but it's being used vindictively, polemically, and therefore politically. It's what is a juristic term is now being reframed and used politically, he's saying. This has turned into an internal dispute. In previous centuries, a controversy existed between the German Kaiser, the king of Hungary, and the Turkish Sultan on the question of whether payments made by the Kaiser to the Sultan were in the nature of a pension or a tribute. The debtor stressed that he did not pay tribute but pension, whereas the creditor considered it to be tribute. In the relation between Christians and Turk, the word were still used in those days more openly and more objectively, and the juristic concepts perhaps had not yet become to the same extent as today political instruments of coercion. Nevertheless, Baudin, who mentions the controversy in the book, Six Books of the Republic, adds that in most instances, pension is paid not to protect oneself from other enemies, but primarily from the protector himself, and to ransom oneself from invasion. Right. So therefore, that's this understanding of this. So let's go here, back here. Right, this leads us off here. This is where we turn back to this long footnote here. This, okay. Above all polemical character determines the use of the word political, regardless of whether the adversary is designated as non-political in the sense of harmless, or vice versa, if one wants to disqualify or denounce him as political in order to portray oneself as non-political, in the sense of a purely scientific, purely moral, purely juristic, purely aesthetic, purely economic, or on the basis of similar purities, and therefore be superior. In other words, this idea that sometimes people use political as a way to say, oh, You're just doing it for political reasons. This is a lower base thing where us more scientific, moral, juristic, aesthetic, economic would understand it differently, right? This is a condescension of the political, right? By this other approach. So that's the first problem of how our language. Therefore, even when doing that, it shows the polemical nature of the thing. Secondly, in the usual domestic polemics, the word political is often is today often used interchangeably with party politics. Right? Again, this is the part things of the parties and the fights of the party. Well, that becomes political. The inevitable lack of objectivity in political decision, which is only the reflex to suppress the politically inherited friend-enemy antithesis, manifests itself in the regrettable forms and aspects of the scramble for office and the politics of patronage. In other words, the nature of the political life of demand for office, running for the scramble for office, and the seeking of patronage. This is what we often recall patronage. This is political. All these things. This is and he thinks this is kind of a okay. It still reflects this usage. Still kind of reflects it, but it's kind of a depoliticized thing. It's moving politics from the contestation of systems to rather subsystemic things, right? The demand of depolitization, which arises in this context, means only the rejection of party politics, etc. Right? In other words, depolitization or administration wants to depoliticize. The equation of politics equal party politics is possible whenever antagonism among domestic political parties succeeds in weakening the all-embracing political unit, the state. In other words, all of a sudden, once there's contestation among parties, then the state, those who want unification of the state, and everyone think the same. This wants administration. It wants no longer having party conflict, party disputes, but rather immediately have administration to it. Right. That's the end of this. Is the modern idea. This is the Hobbesian Hegelian idea, the replacing of political contestation with administration. Right. Depolitization. This is the depolitization of the subsystemic, okay, of the system, right, of the internal aspects of the political community. So yes, there's contestation among states, but within the state there should not be contestation, because if that's why there is this party politics, and therefore, oh my God, there's a problem. We should neutralize or depoliticize and neutralize it, right? The equation of politics equal party is antagonism of domestic political parties succeeds in weakening all-embracing unit the state. The intensification of internal antagonism has the effect of weakening the common identity vis-a-vis another state. Right. Once the internal conflict begins, then this weakens the connection of us versus them. We cease being an us, and therefore maybe some of these people here no longer see the them as a them, but rather a friend to help you against the other. Okay, this is how civil war happens, right? If domestic conflict among political parties had become the sole political difference, the most extreme degree of internal political tension is thereby reached, i.e., the domestic, not the foreign friend-enemy grouping, are decisive for armed conflict. In other words, once the system breaks down and people, in other words, this is the difference between this that at the level of one community to another, but within the community, sub community, that all of a sudden these parts start fighting, and that becomes the domestic conflict and tension becomes the big thing. Then the friend enemy thing is operating at this level and not at the larger level, and this is and not the becomes decisive. In other words, this grouping here at the civil state of this inside of the civil nation becomes decisive for conflict. The ever-present possibility of conflict must always be kept in mind. If one wants to speak of politics, in other words, we must always keep in mind that politics is always going to lead to possible conflict. Right? and therefore the need to want to avoid it, right, in that sense, or at least restrain it and maintain it. If one wants to speak of politics in the context of the primacy of internal politics, then this conflict no longer refers to war between organized uh, nations, but to civil war, right? So therefore, that's the distinction, that nation between nation, this is war, but within the within the nation or in the political community, this becomes civil war, right? The conflict does. So therefore, that the issue, and this is what why Agamben talks about his book Stasis, right? Agamben in his book Stasis talks about the nature of civil war and why civil war is the understanding of the political. Now, yes, when it breaks down, this is the breaking down of a system that leads to civil war and his extreme understanding of stasis. Extrasis and its extremists, and its extreme is civil war. But not all conflict leads to civil war. Some disputes are not that intense. Only the most intense one, when we no longer see each other as sharers of the same community. We see each other as an existential alien, not us anymore. In other words, you can have economic. We can still see each other as brothers, but then we can see each other as economic competitors. Okay, we are still an us, but we're competing with each other. Okay, we're us that we have differences of status and economics. We have difference also maybe religion disputes, but we still see us as us. So that as long as the conflict, the strife does not lead us to no longer see the other as an us within the same bond, the social bond, that we see as an other, a radical other that no longer shares with us anything, then therefore that is the civil war. Okay. For the enemy concept belongs to the ever-present possibility of combat. All peripheral must be left aside from this term, including military details and the development of weapon technology. So ignore the question of military detail. War is armed combat between organized political enemies. Civil war is armed combat within an organized unit. So therefore he's defining it. War is between organized political entities, states, right? And civil war is armed conflict within the state, right? A self-laceration endangers the survival of the latter. Okay? In other words, this is a self-laceration that destroys the nation, okay? The state in that sense, right? The essence of a weapon is that which is meant, that it is a means of physically killing a human being, of physically killing human. The essence of a weapon is a tool, a means. It is a means of physically killing human beings. Just as the term enemy, just as the term enemy, um, just as the term enemy, the term combat too is to be understood in its original sense. It does not mean competition, nor does it mean purely intellectual controversy, nor symbolic wrestling in which, after all, every human being is somehow always involved. For it is a fact that the entire life of a human being is a struggle, and every human being being symbolically a combatant. In other words, it's not struggle. It's not just about struggle. It's not about competition. It's not controversy. Combat means killing people, violence, right? Violence, physical violence, which leads to killing people. In other words, the friend, the enemy, and combat concepts reveal their true meaning precisely because they refer to a real possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity. War is the existential negation of the enemy. Now, this is that little dot. In other words, clearly alludes to the foe concept. In other words, this is that thing. It is the most extreme consequences of enmity. In other words, this is enmity, not only hate, but it's hate that you're going to kill. This enemy, this leads you to the most extreme that you're going to kill. It must be nevertheless remain a real possibility as long as the concept of the enemy remains valid. Okay? In other words, that the idea that this leads to that violence will be involved and the killing will is be necessary. This is what the enemy involves. The idea of the enemy. That their existence is a threat to your existence, and therefore they must be either curtailed, exterminated, eliminated, whatever. This is what is meant by this idea that therefore war follows from entity, and war is an existential negation of the enemy. And its most extreme consequences of enmity, in other words, it is the most extreme consequence of enmity, this elimination of the enemy. It does not have to be a common, normal, or something ideal or desirable. It doesn't have to be something common. It doesn't have to be normal. It doesn't have to be something ideal. It's not an ideal. This is why I think Schmitt is not like, for some people who argue, oh, war is the ultimate ideal of human. No, it's not Schmitt. This is where Schmitt does not think war is an ideal. It may be necessary if the situation calls for it, because if there's a threat to your existence, and that the enemy is an existential threat to you and yours and survival, then yes, but it's not an ideal. It is something that must be addressed. And it must be nevertheless remain a real possibility for as long as the concept of the enemy remains valid. It is by no means as though the political signifies nothing but devastating war, and every political deed a military action. In other words, it doesn't mean that it reduces everything to war. Politics only is war. No. Or that and every nothing but devastating war, and every political action and military action. No. By no means as though every nation would be uninterruptedly faced with the friend enemy alternative vis-a-vis every other nation. And after all, could not the politically reasonable course reside in avoiding war? In other words, the question it doesn't necessarily mean that always war, that always lead to war. And therefore, that's why he ends here. Isn't a alternative, a politically reasonable course is avoiding war? Yes. Yeah, that's easy. Hold on. So let's repeat this again. We finished here the extreme consequence of enmity, where we did this one. Now, sorry, I got to interrupt you for a second. I got a phone call I had to take. It is by no means as though the political signifies nothing but devastating war, right? And indeed, and every political action needs military action. This is where we left off, right? And that every nation would inevitably be faced with the enemy vis-a-vis each other, right? And after all, could not the politically reasonable course of avoiding war? And the answer is yes, right? The definition of the political suggested here neither favors war or militarism, neither imperialism or pacifism. In other words, these are the stratagems or tactics or possibilities, right? He's saying there. It's not one or the other, right? Nor is it an attempt to idealize the victorious war or the successful revolution as a social ideal, since neither war nor revolution is something social or something ideal. Now, this is interesting, this 13 here. Rudolf Stammer's thesis, The Root of Neo-Kantianism, about that the social idea is the community of free-willing individuals, is contradicted by Ernst Kaufmann's Das Wesen, the Volksreich, and the clauses Rebels of Stances. Right? This is he who maintains that not the community of free-willing individuals, but the victorious war is a social idea. The victorious war as the last means towards that lofty goal. The participation and self-assertion of the state in world history. This sentence incorporates typical neo-Kantian liberal notions of social idea. But wars, including victorious wars, are something completely incomprehensible and incompatible with this conception. This idea is then joined with the notion of victorious war, which has its habitat in the Hegelian Rankian philosophy of history, in which social ideas do not exist. The antithesis, which appears at first glance to be striking, thus breaks into two disparate parts, and the rhetorical force of the thunderous contrast can neither veil the structural incoherence nor heal the intellectual breach. So again, this is a rejection of what he says here in 13, right? The military battle itself is not the continuation of politics by other means, as the famous term of Clausewitz is generally incorrectly cited. Okay, right? This von Clausewitz von war, right? War is nothing but the continuation of political intercourse with a mixture of other means. War is for him a mere instrument of politics. This cannot be denied, but its meaning for the understanding of the essence of politics is still not exhausted. To be precise, war for Clausewitz is not merely one of many instruments, but the ultimate ratio, the ultimate ratio of the friend-enemy grouping. War has its own grammar, i.e., special military technical laws. But politics remains his brain. So war has its own rules, but politics is his brain. Right? It does not have its own. It does not have its own logic. This can only be derived from the friend-enemy concept. The logic of it is only derived from the friend-enemy. And the sentence on page 121 reveals this core of politics. Of page 121 on the second edition of that. Right. If war belongs to politics, it will thereby assume its character. The more grandiose and powerful it becomes, so will also the war. And uh, uh, this may be carried to the point at which war reaches its absolute form. So that's where now he's quoting. This note is from the part of 32 edition, which points out this aspect here. War has its own strategy, tactical, and other rules and points of view, but they all presuppose that the political decision had already been made as to who the enemy is. In other words, war is dependent upon the political. The who's the enemy. War is the means by which we fight, but who is the enemy is determined as a political question. It's determined by the political. In war, the adversaries most often confront each other openly. Normally, they are identifiable by a uniform, and the distinction of friend and enemy is therefore no longer a political problem, which the fighting soldier has to solve. A British diplomat correctly stated in the context that the politician is better schooled for battle than the soldier, because the politician fights his whole life, where the soldier does so in exceptional circumstances only. In other words, the diplomat doesn't see in other words, the soldier confronts his enemy because it's open. He's wearing a different uniform. It's clear. But political life, they're not uniformed. It's less than clear. The diplomat is what? Fighting people not in uniform. It's less clear, and therefore it is. That's why the British diplomat says the soldier is less schooled, because the soldier doesn't have to deal with the complexity of the possibility. Who's the enemy? Who's the enemy? Who's the foe? Who's the friend? Who's the foe? In other words, as such as the diplomat has to do. The friend, in other words, the enemy and the friend in traditional warfare was clear. In other words, modern warfare, hybrid warfare, because of terrorism and things like this, and guerrilla war makes it more complicated and problematizes it, right? He says, exceptional circumstance only. The war is neither the aim nor the purpose, nor even the very context of politics. So war is neither the aim nor the purpose, nor even the very context of it, but it is an ever-present possibility. It is the leading presupposition which determines in a characteristic way human action and thinking, and whereby creates a specific political behavior. In other words, he's saying that war is the possibility that can emerge out of it. In other words, it's not that civil war can out of it. It's not the ultimate goal or something we should desire or ideal or something like this. In other words, war is neither the aim nor the purpose, nor even the very context of what he's saying, right? But a possibility, an ever-present possibility. And it's, in other words, it's a presupposition that every human being and thinking, and whereby creates, and therefore this creates this possibility of this consequence of this dispute or action, or this thought or this choice of contestation. This is political behavior in that sense. The criterion of the friend-enemy distinction in no way implies that one particular nation must forever be friend and enemy, or another specific nation, or that a state of neutrality is not possible, or even not, or could not be politically reasonable. In other words, there's no permanent. In other words, the question here is the question of what the situation. In other words, it's not. It's not. There's no criteria of the friend enemy that implies that one people should be friends or enemies, or that one specific nation, or that a state of neutrality is not possible or could not be reasonable. In other words, not everything is always. In other words, it depends on something. It depends on what's going, the context of what is happening, the actual situation, the actual issue, the actual dispute. Right. As with every political concept, the neutrality concept too is a subject of the ultimate presupposition of a real possibility of a friend-enemy grouping. So even the neutrality, in other words, yes, war itself, but neutral. That's why what George Washington in the his Washington in his second administration, dealing with the problems of the French Revolution, makes a proclamation of neutrality, and this drove the Congress crazy. This led to the famous pacifist Havidivist debate between Hamilton and Madison, right? Which Madison didn't like. Havidivist didn't like that the president made this without the consenting Congress, because Congress declares war. Therefore, maybe Congress should declare neutrality as well. What was Washington, by his own initiative, declares a proclamation of neutrality, and this is a political act. This declaration of neutrality is much a political act in Schmitt's point. So in many ways, Madison's Madison's criticisms of Washington's position is maybe in agreement with Schmitt here in that sense. In other words, that should only neutrality prevail in the world, then not only war but also neutrality itself would come into the end. So therefore, that's the problem: is that if everything's neutral, this is the thing, then even neutrality doesn't mean anything, right? War would end, but also neutrality. The politics of avoiding war terminates, as does all politics, whenever the possibility of fighting disappears. So when fighting disappears, politics disappear. The end of politics. The end of and if you end war, you end the possibility of fighting. You end the possibility of fighting. You end not only you end war, but you also end politics. What always matters is the possibility of an extreme case taking place, the real war, the real decision whether this situation has arrived or not. In other words, the war is in other words is the whether we need to go to war, whether we need to fight to do this. That's the decision. Do we need to do this or don't we need to do this? Should we do it or not? Must we or must we not? Is it why? In other words, this question, this decision of this to wage conflict. Conflict is a possibility of any situation of contestation. Does the situation justify or necessitate this for the survival of the community? Right? Okay, and that's the question here, right? The survival or the benefit of even the benefit of the community, the good. This is the extreme situation. And see, Schmitt seems to. This is where maybe the liberal position. See, we look at this and Schmitt argues here for the extreme case, that survival, this existential extreme of the community is threatened. But most contestation is not that extreme. Okay, most contestation is more about interest, utility, benefit, and harm, but not existential ceasing to exist. Now, what he says makes sense at this existential level, but what about this intermediate level? Okay, that's another thing. Is this a situation of extreme in extremis, not in maybe that's the and actually this is why I'm very interested in book 5 of Aristotle's Politics, because of the problem of stasis, what is meant by stasis, and the different levels of stasis that he describes in uh, chapter 3, all these various these 11 and then maybe 11 plus, 11, 5 more, so 16, 15 of 14 of them, 11, 15 of them, 15 varieties, because the 11th has 5 varieties of the reasons of how this operates, of how these different, the emergence of stasis and the consequences that create stasis. That leads to the condition that we have, or the changing, the political regime change in that sense, or the cause of conflict, of internal conflict in the system. And in other words, the politics of avoiding war terminates as all. In other words, should the politics of avoiding war terminates as all politics does all politics whenever the possibility of fighting disappears. What always matters is the possibility of the extreme case taking place, the real war, and this decision whether the situation has arrived or not. That's where we ended. Now let's continue. That extreme case appears to be an exception, does not negate its decisive character, but conform it to the most. In other words, the argument here is that this such case that he's pointing to is an extreme case, not the norm, not the norm. But he says that therefore doesn't destroy this importance of this. To the extent that war today has decreased in number and frequency, they have proportionally increased in ferocity. War is still today the most extreme possibility. One can say that the exceptional case has especially decisive meaning, which exposes the core of the matter. In other words, that in other words, even though it's in other words, war has become more intense, and therefore, when war does happen, it becomes really bad, right? Because in that sense, maybe that's what doesn't destroy this when the danger of that, right? Um, One can say that the exceptional case has become exceptionally decisive meaning, which exposes the core of the matter. For only in real combat is revealed. For only in real combat is revealed the most extreme consequences of the political grouping of friends and enemies. So only in this argument, the ultimate consequences of the political grouping of friends and enemies is revealed in real combat. From the most extreme possible human life, from this most extreme possibility, human life derives its specifically political tension. So this extreme possibility of life, of conflict, of life and death, of extreme existence. This is the political tension emerges out of this. A world in which the possibility of war is utterly eliminated, a completely pacified globe, would be a world without the distinction of friend and enemy, and hence a world without politics. Right? That's that wonderful title from Minot, right? Pierre Minot's book War Without Politics, right? It is. So, hence the world without politics, right? Is this? It's conceivable that such a world might contain many very interesting antitheses and contrasts, competitions and intrigues of every kind, but there would not be a meaningful. It would not be a meaningful antithesis whereby men could be required to sacrifice life, authorized to shed blood, to kill other human beings. So that, in other words, that this other world may have interesting things, but it's not enough to kill people, to shed blood. In other words, this is this for the definition of the political. It and this is, I mean, that's not this is why the libertarians see, the libertarians have in their phobia of war. Remember, Schmitt is not praising war. He's saying that war is only a consequence, is the ultimate possibility of the political. But the libertarian position wants to avoid war. They want to find a way to completely negate war. Now he's saying that, of course, this might be competition, wonderful things, right? He says here, but it would really fundamentally means that nothing. It makes life that it's no longer something that we would want to kill for. Now this is all liberals say, oh great, isn't that a wonderful world? This is that world, John Lennon's Imagine. This is why the libertarians make fun of that, but their perception of economic life, where that there's no need for killing each other, there's no need for this, is the same utopianistic aspect of as that John Lennon view of this kind of weird life of this, that there's nothing to kill each other for. This intensity of this. No, but isn't that horrible? Oh, isn't that barbaric? No, it's human. It is tied to our something about our humanity in that sense. Now this is now I agree. I would agree. The ancients would argue that this is not that he radicalized it. He takes the extremis, the extreme point, and he points to the extreme. Where the ancients might say, no, that's the extreme. That there is also the things, the opposite, the friend, right? The bonds together. He focuses on the enemy, not on what makes us friends. Okay, this is the problem. The extremists of war is one half of the problem. Okay, the other thing is, how do we come together and form a life together, is the other half of the question, which he seems to not address, or maybe because he's responding to the liberal. In other words, the liberal who does have an answer for that, but wants to negate war. Schmitt negates. In other words, this is the polemical character of this essay, that he almost seems to take the opposite position of the liberal, and in doing so, maybe that's the distortion of it, right? That's the whole point. So let's continue here, right? That's really it's conceivable as such it might have interesting antithesis and contrast, conceptions, but there would not be a meaningful antithesis whereby men would require to sacrifice life, authorize to shed blood, and kill other human beings. For the definition of the political, it is here even irrelevant whether such a world without politics is desirable as an ideal situation. The phenomena of the political can be understood only in the context of the ever-present possibility of the friend-enemy grouping, regardless of the aspects which this possibility implies for morality, aesthetics, and economics. Next sentence. War is the most extreme political means disclose the possibility which underlies every political idea, namely the distinction of friend. In other words, war is the extreme outcome of this thing, and only that for the extreme, the extremist defines it in that sense. This makes sense only as long as this distinction in mankind is actually present, or at least potentially possible. So this idea that as long as there's contestation and dispute. On the other hand, it would be senseless to wage war for purely religious, purely moral, purely juristic, or purely economic motives. This is interesting. He says, war, the killing only makes sense for this existential understanding. It doesn't make sense. It would be senseless to wage war for purely religious, purely moral, purely juristic, or purely economic. Okay, let's think about that for a second. Because why? Because I think this is the category. I think he's saying that in other words, those things, those criteria have different categories. Not war. War is this friend enemy, out of the friend enemy, and the existential crisis of conflict, right? Of the friend enemy thing, of destruction. The friend enemy grouping and therefore also war cannot be derived from these specific antitheses of human endeavor. So, in other words, friend enemy and also therefore war cannot be derived from the religious, the moral, the juristic, or economic. That's interesting. Now, okay, war needs to be neither something religious nor something morally good, nor something lucrative. War today is, in all likelihood, none of these. Okay? This obvious point is the most confused by the fact that religious, moral, and other antitheses can intensify to political ones. So these courses, in other words, the religious, moral, and other antitheses can intensify their intensity to become political ones where you want to kill. But in other words, but war is not a extremist situation of those other ones. He's trying to say, right? In other words, they're confused by the fact that all these things, other entities, can intensify to political ones and can bring about the decisive friend or enemy constellations. Therefore, these other ones can intensify the religious, the moral, and the religious, the moral, and the other antitheses can intensify to the point where it becomes the political and the political friend and enemy reality, where there is a conflict, which is one at an existential conflict of us versus them, of where of exterminate, eliminating of violence is forced upon you in that sense, right? Um, so therefore, they bring about decisive friends. In fact, this occurs then the relevant antithesis is no longer purely religious, moral, or economic, but political. In other words, those things now become political. It's no longer understood in terms of the religious, the moral, or economic. Right. The sole question, the sole remaining question then is always whether such a friend-enemy grouping is really at hand, regardless of which human motives are sufficiently strong to have brought it about. So therefore, the question is it a friend-enemy moment? Is this a friend-enemy moment where, in other words, we have a contestation here that is existential, or this is a threat to our existence or our being, our well-being. In other words, you don't have to go to war. You just have to know that this threat is there. Is it real? In other words, that it doesn't. Again, there's a possibility that this relation dynamic has the possibility in extremis of killing each other. Not that, in other words, he's not saying that you will go kill each other, or that it requires you to start killing each other. But that this distinction between the friend and the other, the friend and the enemy, is that the possibility in if the situation gets in extremis, the extreme, that they will have to, or it could produce the conflict where one would have to kill the other for the survival or the maintain the continuation of itself, right? The sole remaining question then is always whether the friend and its grouping is really at hand, regardless of the human motives are sufficiently strong to have been brought about. That's the whole point how it ends that paragraph. Nothing can escape this logical conclusion. Nothing can escape this logical conclusion of the political. If pacifist hostility towards war were so strong as to drive pacifists into war against non-pacifists, it's a war against war. That would prove that pacifism truly possessed political energy because it is sufficiently strong to group men according to friends and enemy, right? In other words, this is his example here. That if pacifists, we must wage war against war, and it's so strong that we are groupists together that we would then go seek to stop and use violence against those who we are threatened by, right? If in fact that the will to abolish war is so strong that it no longer shuns war, then it has become a political motive, i.e., it affirms, even if only as the extreme possibility, war and even the reason for war. In other words, this is ironically, this is a pacifism. It becomes a political tension. It becomes political when it sees the other one that must be overcome and must be forced to do so. Presently, this appears to be a particular way of justifying wars. The war is then considered to constitute the absolute last war of humanity. The war is thus, this is how World War I, the war to end all wars, right? This is the way the liberal progressive, the liberal progressive mind understood why we're going to go fight this world war, right? And that we had to basically find ways to limit wars or prevent wars, to end wars, and that if we're going to wage war, we're going to wage war for this idealistic goal of ending war. But that's a political motivation. Pacifism is now politicized as a political motive, right? He's saying here, such a war is necessary, unusually intense, and inhuman by transcending the limits of political framework. It simultaneously degrades the enemy into a moral in other categories, and is forced to make him a monster that must not only be defeated, but also utterly destroyed. Now, this is interesting. Once you take in these moral dimensions, these other dimensions, once you take the political and then you moralize it, right? You moralize it in this thing, and you moralize it in terms of the path of this idea of waging war and war. What you do is you turn the enemy into something, instead of something human that you have for the sake of the situation, that your survival and their survival, that they're still human, and you do it. Now you turn it into a monster that you must exterminate, like zombie movies. We have to exterminate the zombies. Like, this is the nature of modern politics. The progressive humanitarian mind sees the enemy as zombies that are existential threat that can only be killed, that can only be destroyed, must be destroyed. Come on, isn't this how the Remainers view the Brexiteers? Isn't this how the blue Democrat world views the MAGA people? Right, exterminate them. They're the deplorable. They're the horrible. They're the monstrous. They must be overcome. Right. Therefore, they must be not only they turn them into a monster that must not only be defeated but also be destroyed. This is what's wrong with the progress. Schmitt is criticizing this way of war, this humanitarian idealism of like the First World War, like the idea of war against war. We're bringing in we're understanding the political in light of a moral or philosophical construct that forces the dehumanization of the opponent, right? That this is what he's saying against. His argument is that the political doesn't necessarily mean the dehumanization of it. That you can recognize that the other person, the political realm the political reality just sees the enemy as an enemy. That yes, it would require killing him, but you're killing a fellow. He's not really a monster. He's just your enemy. He's your political enemy. But what happens when this other idea happens is that you turn him into a monster, that it must be defeated. Not only defeated, but utterly destroyed. In other words, he is an enemy who no longer must be compelled to retreat into his border only. In other words, he is an enemy who no longer must be compelled to retreat into his border only. In other words, the idea of the traditional war is we wage war to kind of force them into their own territory. That's the idea. We protect our own. This is our own zone. This is our own world, and that we don't want anyone coming into hurting us. Or if we're waging war with someone else because they're our friends, and someone attacks them, we help them to push them out of there. Maybe we wage a war because of we have some competing interest, and we gain that, we fight that to get that interest, right? Because we need that interest for our survival or our maintaining. But again, this is tied to what our survival requires, our need requires the achieving of this interest. But therefore, once the enemy has given up that, and once that we don't have to exterminate them. The Nazi and the communist embraces the ideal of an ideology which induces an intellectual moralistic construction, which then therefore Schmitt here is not this proves Schmitt is not Nazi. Right here, this line what he says here. It's a warning against the Nazi in that sense. The Nazi dehumanizes the Nazi by his dehumanization of things distorts the political. It forces him to what? See the enemy as something must be obliterated in this most extreme sense. It's a monster needs to be not merely just pushed in its own sphere. It must be eliminated totally. The fees, in other words, this is that footnote here. Again, this is again the friend foe distinction. The feasibility of such war is particularly illustrated by the fact that war is the real possibility is still present today. For this fact is crucial for the friend and enemy antithesis and for the recognition of politics. In other words, the feasibility of a war of conflict, of even this horrible war created by ideology, it still means politics still exists. Maybe what happens is the political realm needs to moderate the ideological, because if it's driven by ideological, it doesn't deny the politics, it just radicalizes and intensifies and takes it even more extreme in that sense. So let's do this. The feasibility of such war, right? Of this really harsh war of modern idealism, modern idealism of fighting pacifism, the humanity, us humanitarians wishing to stop the enemy of those things. We're going to go into this total war, and then because they're the enemy of humanity, we must exterminate them. We must destroy them. Just pushing them into the nice little realm is not good enough, right? It's the retreat must not be compelled into retreat into his own borders only, right? The feasibility of this kind of war is particularly illustrated in the fact that war is still a real possibility even today in this ideological world. So even in this world where we say we're against, even though we are in this cosmopolitan world, we think we're above war and we're above politics. We're not above politics, because even this is why the Hillary Clintons of the world and the progressives and the neoliberals, they say, oh, we're beyond the world of conflict and world of politics. Well, but they know, because look how they treat those who they oppose. They have people who oppose them, and they look how they treat them. They demonize them, destroy them, marginalize them, and they cannot tolerate them, and that they need to exterminate them or oppress them. And this is the nature. Therefore, this shows the polemical character or the political character that even in this time of we believing we're above politics now, the political still remains. Okay, on this note, this has been a long one. This is probably we have many interruptions. I apologize. If you have any comments or issues or questions about this section, this long section, please put them below, and I will deal with them. If you liked it, please say share it with a friend, get it around, put it on your social media, spread it around. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. If you didn't like it, like this, but say why in the comments, so you know what's wrong, and maybe we can learn from it. You can follow me on social media if you want to help me continue doing these links below. If you want to help me do this, to help me fund this a little bit and do things with me so I can expand and continue some of these projects, you could always do it by to subscribe to our Patreon list below, or you can go buy one of my books, again listed below. Okay, that's it for now. I'm getting ahead. I should do my again. Montesquieu's are Monday and Wednesdays. I'm going to be doing Montesquieu still. This. Maybe I'm doing Thursday. Maybe I don't do Thursday. Tuesday, middle the weeks I'm not doing this. I might skip a week on Schmitt, but then if I've done it already, then it'll be in our list of things so you can catch it. So if you're not doing this live or not doing this as we go about, then maybe you can see how you're doing it later or coming to this after I did this. You might not understand this in that sense. So okay, and then also remember every Friday I try to do my live stream. So my live stream at the same time at 12 o'clock noon on Eastern Standard Time U.S., which is around 6 p.m. in Central European time. So therefore, that's where I remember. That's where I'm Central European time. So Okay, well, take care and have a good day. Bye-bye. See you next time.